In my opinion, the world's 2010 finals is still one of the greatest recorded debates ever, where basically every speaker was performing at a near godlike level. I watched it when I was just starting debate and I thought, wow, now that is public speaking at its finest. And even until today, I watched it again recently and I still think it's truly timeless. Not only because the speeches are so easy to listen to, even if you're not a debater, but because they are all so passionate and so incisive in a way that unifies the performance and science of debating like no other. The motion was, this house believes that the media should show the full horror of war. And the lesson I want to focus on in this video is that when we are debating for a public audience at a grand stage such as this, debating is at its peak when speakers truly, deeply immerse themselves in the drama of the moment and fearlessly engage at the most contentious of issues. They phrase their answers so well, and they deliver their examples so well. There are two particular moments that I will highlight for this video. The first moment is how DPM Cormac Early answers the POIs raised by the opposition. At this point, OG has already identified that the debate is not merely one about the freedom of the media and good journalism, but it is about whether the information of the horrors of war skews the decision-making of the public, or if it makes them more capable in engaging with the discourse of ongoing wars, especially since it is necessary to counterbalance the lack of accountability for the generals that lead these wars. The DPM brilliantly says the following: because the generals were wrong, and the generals can be wrong, and they will continue to be wrong as long as there is no accountability and no check on them, because the media is too cowardly to show what they are doing. We think that the politicians need the cover of public outrage where soldiers are being asked on behalf of the public to commit actions that we would never countenance if we were fully aware of them. Reactions to war, understanding of war, is necessarily visceral. It necessarily comes at a pre-analytic level where we see suffering and we react to it. That's why statistics and print media won't fully do. We want images and we think the public deserve them. Now notice, as early as now, we have already established that the DPM concedes that visceral reactions are necessary, that visceral reactions will happen, and that this is the highlight of the argument because statistics and print media hide a lot of the atrocities in war, and that people's reaction to suffering is the best counterbalance against the actions of states or the actions of generals. So at this point, right, closing opposition asks, which is it? Some of the public sees the violence in Rwanda and is more likely to go in, or it sees the violence of Saddam Hussein and is less likely to go in. Now, pause again. This POI, in my opinion, perfectly captures the extension that closing opposition will later make in this debate, which is that the public's visceral reactions are unreliable and incompatible with good military decision-making for war. And they essentially make a trap comparative in this POI. Of course, the argument of DPM is not necessarily about whether intervention is good or bad, but the POI is certainly forcing some nuance on how people should be characterized. Will they react in a way that deters conflict or encourages more conflict? And of course, DPM answers poetically. And let us not understate how effective this simple and powerful answer is in clearing up what the real comparative is. It sees the violence in Rwanda, and it sees an outrage on the conscience of the world. It sees the violence in Iraq, and it sees an outrage on the conscience of the United States. We think very clearly that the public is able to distinguish between just wars, wars of necessity, and wars of choice. That is the distinction. So we think what we are doing will make just wars more likely and unjust wars less likely because we do have empathy with the people of Rwanda. We would have empathy with the people of Darfur if we could see what was being done to them, and we would not ourselves choose to start conflicts in which that kind of thing would be done to innocent people for no real reason. So while the POI attempted to trap DPM into making it about intervention yes or no, DPM makes it about just wars or unjust wars being identified by the public. And notice again here, we see an evolution of the argument. A while ago, it was the visceral reaction. Now, it's the explanation that the public has empathy in their visceral reaction. It is innate to that visceral reaction that people's reaction to suffering will be empathetic. Then, CO asks another POI, which essentially has the same flavor, but specifies the question a little bit more. Which is it? People's reaction to violence is always visceral, or it leads them to an in-depth discussion of just war theory. Now, I want to highlight the reason why they're asking this specific POI, which is that a while ago, DPM's response was contingent on pre-analytic visceral responses that make people outraged to their politicians. And so CO is trying to say that this characterization is in tension with the succeeding claim of DPM, which is that they will have empathy, which we literally just mentioned a while ago, to distinguish just wars from unjust wars when seeing suffering. So in complete fairness, DPM's reply to this is as accurate in the framing as can be, and they answer very glibly, both. And this is because the claim DPM is attempting to make here is that passionate, visceral responses to suffering are indeed completely rational and good and democratic, and that this empathy is necessary to distinguish just wars from unjust wars. So please keep this particular answer in mind, because closing half is just about to start cooking. The second moment that I want to then highlight is arguably the greatest and most contentious closing half in world history. So please watch the closing half and then go back to this video. MG Shenwu goes and constructs an extension essentially on this. It is not merely that the media not covering conflict leads to less information, but it is that states actively conceal information behind the veil of words through euphemism and controlled language in the media so that they can basically brainwash the public to support unaccountable engagements in war. So MG says, pacification means machine gunning villagers to drive them out of the area. Collateral damage means people torn to pieces, limbs flown apart because of your bombs. Intensive interrogation means torture, no matter what the American government would like us to believe it means. So it's the same line of attack as the OG, but beginning from a contextualization that states that public perception is actively skewed now because of state pseudo-censorship. So notice how this actively engages with the POI exchange earlier, as CO's POIs merely assumed that visceral reactions happen at the expense of proper military decision-making. So CG now is attempting to push that the status quo exploits the muted reactions of the public, thereby also extending on the argument of DPM and opening government that many of these states and generals are very unaccountable. Furthermore, this framing allows CG's formulation of the visceral reaction to be specified in a very beautiful way through the storytelling of one example. But we can't show that to the world until we show it on TV, which is why CNN decided to show what it was like to have Christopher Hitchens waterboarded massively changed American public opinion on whether or not waterboarding was torture. You pierce that veil of words so that our moral sentiments can see the truth. And notice that CG is still making the case that people can be empathetic and use their moral sentiments, but MG brilliantly explains concretely how this happens with the Christopher Hitchens example, which the audience is very much familiar with. So let me highlight one last moment of brilliancy that Shengwu does to preempt the closing opposition case. Because again, a while ago, the closing opposition case through their POIs is quite clear and it's quite intuitive. So CG does this instead. The best moral decisions are not dispassionate because we can't get a priori rational grounds on which to intervene in genocide. We intervene in genocide even if we can't construct a purely rational reason to do so. Because ultimately, much of our morality is grounded in our common humanity. is grounded in that feeling in our breast that says, there's another human being hurt and I need to save them now. And that kind of immediacy is lost by their policy. That's why going to Auschwitz, seeing the gas chambers, touching the walls, makes you understand the experience in a special way. So now, what we have is a case that goes as a hard line as it needs to be. That even if it is a visceral and emotional reaction, this reaction is not only good and democratic and rational, as what OG was saying, but it is the most moral thing to do, and that is why it is just. This nuance is incredible, as it takes the same argument, frames it in a context of moral urgency, and packages it with the most vibrant of examples to display why this is the right thing to do. So that's the closing government case. How do Chris Koch and Steve Hind respond from closing opposition, knowing that their extension will be centered around the importance of exclusive military decision-making to fight efficient and good wars? Now, what I want to highlight immediately here and point out is that their win condition, as they quite instantly identify, is in unpacking whether moral decisions necessitate the full depiction of brutality and horror. MO says that there is no universal glibness about the costs of war because the public is already inherently predisposed to already oppose wars as it is. Then they proceed to explain a quite hardline case that says that politicians and generals should have leeway in controlling the spread of information during wartime because the public cannot meaningfully appreciate the strategic value of this in fighting wars, as they are risk-averse when it comes to potential suffering, which in some way, right, attempts to respond to the empathy and moral sentiments claim from the government bench. And here's the example MO uses. When the American public saw soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, that meant that they had no goodwill to go into Rwanda. When we empower enemy propaganda with the images in this case, that would be presented without the necessary context and be presented in slanted ways, the credibility of our soft power is inevitably damaged. So notice that MO is engaging in two fronts here. The first front being how people respond with their moral sentiments and empathy, and the second with how the media is likely going to portray this and how the information of the horrors of war can be weaponized for intentions that are not what it was originally intended or created for. So at this point, in my opinion, MO merely laid down the seeds, set up the alley-oop for what is eventually probably one of the most incisive introductions I have seen for a World Grand Final. OpWIP begins and positions this extension in this way. And please, watch it first and then go back to this video again because it deserves that replay. In Mogadishu in 1992, one dead American pilot was dragged through the streets for everyone to see on TV, and Bill Clinton was forced to leave Somalia and let the country burn. He was forced to not go into Rwanda and let people die in the hundreds of thousands. That's the gap between learning with empathy about conflict and seeing the visceral reaction of brutality. So the CO case is exceptionally clear, and it uncovers the vulnerability of the Gov case. That empathy, that moral sentiments are necessarily biased and skewed in a way that is not for common humanity in general, but that disproportionately privileges some over others. And more importantly, that this process of leaving it to the media actively fixates on particular sufferings that ruin any prospect of evaluating wars for their total suffering. And of course, while this alone does not completely prove the comparative on whether censorship leads to the better conduct of war, it does at minimum nuance that graphic images activate moral sentiments in a more so unproductive way than not, which at least is most critical for the contention in the closing half. And the POI given by JLM at GovWIP perfectly captures the brilliance of this closing half. JLM says governments nor generals should decide, people should be able to evaluate it for themselves. And OpWIP replies that there is a difference between empathy and the visceral reaction, that empathy is generated from reading about suffering because dispassionate objectivity allows for that distance, whilst a visceral reaction from seeing disemboweled corpses of Americans hanging in Fallujah is going to create that unproductive outcome of people leaving wars too early or not being able to engage in wars meaningfully at all. And so, of course, at this point, right, both sides are still completely right here. CG is excellent in claiming that governments can still cover up the atrocities in war, and closing opposition is excellent in claiming that visceral reactions induce preferential moral sentiments that harm those wars as well. And Opwhip even goes further to say that because of these particular moral preferences, they become even more vengeful and encourage indiscriminate war as well. And again, this is excellent in exploiting and pushing that moral sentiment exaggerated claim to the extreme. That moral sentiments again are biased and that they are not fair. And at least for closing opposition, it does the bare work, enough work to be able to claim that leaving it to the generals, leaving it to the states, implicitly is better than allowing the public and the images having free reign for whatever emotional biased reaction that will lead to an unproductive war that will delay conflict or make it harder for us to solve conflict. Now, again, let me point out, right, at the end of this debate, of course, it is still incredibly contentious whether or not generals are more or less accountable with the existence of graphic images. And it's also still likely hanging on whether or not wars actually become more moral or not. But from my perspective, it is certainly the case that there are so many lessons that we can learn from this debate when it comes to sharpening your framing, responding more directly, and of course, bringing examples into life within your argument. I just love this debate because it inspired me to read more, to be more passionate when I'm speaking, and to strive to argue at the highest levels as well. Alright, that's it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed this VOD review and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.